Alex is here. David Schaefer, who is the director, will introduce the afternoon session. So he will tell you maybe a little bit about what Baker Climate Hub does. BIDMaP is an organization at Berkeley. It's at the intersection of material science, chemistry on one hand, and AI on the other, with interested in applications in climate change. And today we'll have two more science-oriented sessions, and in the afternoon we'll go to more commercialization. In the morning we have two sessions, one on foundation models, session by David Blau, who I with this introduce. Good morning, David. Sam, I said David, no, sorry, Sam. Yeah, by Sam Blau. And and after that we have a session on fire management, which is to our heart here in California. With that, I will give it to David, and I have to let you know, to Sam, I'm really tired. Yes, do that. And I have to really say, I'm sorry, I'm teaching at 9:30 Berkeley time, so if I run out, that's not because the last speaker is really boring. I know she will not be, but I have to run out whether she finishes on time or not. So with that, Sam, finally.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Nice to see everyone here. Looking forward to some exciting talks and some great discussion. So this is going to be a session on foundation models for chemistry and materials. And I'll introduce our first speaker, Gabor Chani. Gabor is a professor of molecular modeling at Cambridge University. And he's internationally recognized for pioneering work in atomistic simulations, particularly multi-scale modeling that bridges quantum mechanics and larger scale material development. He's the developer of MACE MP0, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, a powerful model for simulating dynamics in inorganic crystals and arbitrary materials. And he was a recipient of the 2010 F.W. Bessel Research Award through the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. So Gabor's going to be speaking first, then Teresa Head-Gordon, who I'll introduce when she's ready to go.
Thank you very much. Always huge pleasure to come back to California and to Berkeley in particular. This is a sort of a compressed version of this talk. You've heard, I guess yesterday, the importance, these things, about the importance of materials to many things in life, but in particular to any advances we want to make and changes we want to make to our planet. So I won't, in this short talk, I won't recap all those motivations, but tell you about quantum mechanical modeling and the huge advances that have taken place over the last 15 years. Many of them have actually been sort of contributed to and invented by some people in the room. So let me just remind you how first principles molecular dynamics has actually revolutionized how we think about microscopic scales and how it gives us understanding that's not available otherwise. So these are just three areas in which, without simulation from bottom up, without solving the equations of quantum mechanics in some approximation, we wouldn't have a good understanding of what's going on. So the first example are phase diagrams of materials. And of course, that's a target of experiments too, but when you do it in simulation, you can do it under extreme conditions. So this is the phase diagram of carbon, and this is 10,000 degrees. And this is 2 terapascals. So you can actually find out what materials do the core of the Earth, core of other planets, and interpret experimental data in the regime over and here with half a terapascal of pressure or 1,000 degrees, where the experimental techniques get very difficult. So over on the right, I have a different kind of simulation. So this is aqueous solutions of polyatomic ions, and this is I don't want to discuss the details of these results, but you see there's some agreement between something and something. So that's experiment that's experiment and computation. So it's just a demonstration that these things get things right. It happens to be the ionization potential. Once you validate that the first principle simulation is doing its thing correctly, if the approximations are holding for the particular application, then you can study what you can't study otherwise. So atomistic details, structure and dynamics on the atomic scale. And similarly, in surface science, which has hugely dominated our understanding of catalysis and many other properties under UHV over the experimental techniques have been developing and refining in leaps and bounds over the last 30 years. This is this bar scale is 2.5 nanometers. This is titanium oxide, and these are molecules adsorbed on the oxide surface. And this is an experimental image where you can follow individual molecules, but you cannot quite make out the atoms, right? That's the resolution of the experiment. And here on the right, there are structures which you can create in the computer, simulate them with quantum mechanical precision, and that helps interpret the experiments. Lots and lots of fields and lots of properties are essentially within our grasp. Stability, catalytic reactions, drug properties, semiconductor effects, all of them come with limitations, but within those limitations, size and time scale, but within that, all of this is accessible. So how do we actually do those simulations? There's a whole bunch of techniques, and they form a hierarchy. So this is a hierarchy starting at the bottom here with quantum chemistry, where given enough compute and given the system is small enough, so we can only do but if you give 10 atoms, we can solve the many-body Schrödinger equation really, really precisely. If you want to go larger, you have to make approximations. And what I've sort of listed here are the keywords underlying the key approximations that go into the key names of techniques that implement those approximations through density functional theory, force fields, empirical force fields, coarse-grained molecular dynamics, and then ultimately this is not a modeling technique, that's the chemistry lab. You actually have to go and connect to what is observed in reality. And I want to talk about force fields because that's the topic of my talk. And force fields in particular have helped us look at the increase in capability in the number of atoms. So you have 10, 50, 100, 1,000, and suddenly there's a million. So a 1,000-fold increase is when you stop treating electrons. So all these techniques here treat electrons explicitly, and then when you drop electrons and say, I'm interested in where the atoms go, what reactions take place, how the structure of matter evolves, you're not interested in the electrons anymore, then you can do a lot more. But empirical force fields have had a huge run in the last 50 years, and the arrows indicate just the idea that some of the force fields are parameterized by doing quantum mechanics, particularly short-range properties, so vibrational modes, its length of bonds and the angles between bonds are obtained from first principles and baked in to the model that's being used. But then other properties are really iterated with experiments. So solvation, density, and other macroscopic viscosity, other dynamical properties are tuned to reproduce experimental data. And when you do this carefully and validate carefully, then a huge amount of science can be done with force fields. What I'm trying to do is actually something different, is to get rid of this set of arrows and create force fields that simply continue this philosophy of first principles simulation. So you come from quantum chemistry, you go through density functional theory, and can we distill a force field from the quantum mechanical equations without any recourse to without fitting to macroscopic properties. And this will entail some other limitations. We won't be able to do millions or tens of millions of atoms. We won't be able to go to microseconds, but we maintain the idea of first principles modeling. We get the right answer for the right reason, and that essentially means that we can aim to have no loss of accuracy compared to the lower length scale methods in as far as atomistic structure is concerned. But we still gain, the aim is to still gain a lot. So we gain about a factor of 1 million when we do this, compared to, let's say, density functional theory, and that means one can accomplish a lot more. So this is a sweet spot. This is spot which is sort of crying out for speed up. This is the utilization of the UK's national computing facility. The figure itself is a couple of years old, but percentages don't really change. This is the moment when I have to say, rest in peace, UK computing. This machine is getting shut down in November, and there's no replacement for the moment. But you can see that the top code is VASP. People are using it to do DFT molecular dynamics, and it takes about 35% of all academic UK compute. I'm saying all because this is by far the largest machine. And then if you add up the other green bars, there are other codes. Together, about 40% of academic HPC is being spent on DFT MD. And if you could do that a million times faster, then you could achieve a lot more. So what do we need to do that? We need to use machine learning. So it's using machine learning as a surrogate model, as an interpolant. So we take small systems. Here's an example of amorphous carbon. We take a couple of hundred, a couple of thousands small examples where we can carry out the quantum mechanics. That gives us points on the potential energy surface. And then we use very clever representations of atomic environments and regression schemes, a variety of them, linear regression, kernel regression, neural network regression, to create interpolants. So that's the blue line. And then that gives us energies, epsilon on every atom, force F on I, every atom I, and we can either do the molecular dynamics if we think it's good enough, validate it. If it's not good enough, you come back and do some more. And this cycle of iteratively converging on the potential energy surface at will is what essentially is machine learning, creating machine learning force fields. And if this thing converges, and it converges sufficiently fast, then we have achieved our goal. So I'm going to show you an example from a few years ago, which is how we used to do this up until recently, and this is sort of the success of the last 15 years. So this example is from catalysis. And so the example here is this indium oxide surface with a vacancy, an oxygen vacancy, and the system is carbon dioxide being converted to methanol. You can see what's happening here. Let me play it again. So this is carbon dioxide, and the hydrogen is getting added. It's bound to this active site where the oxygen vacancy is. And we selected this because it's been very well studied with DFT. So we know what we should be getting. And the question is, what does it take? What kind of iterative refinement does it take to create a fast model that is essentially equivalent to the quantum mechanics, at least as far as studying this particular system? And what you see here is a flow diagram, and this is just to illustrate the sort of level of effort and complexity that was required at this time to create such a model. So we start with the data from the MITRES project. You get data for the bulk and the surface of indium oxide. You do various things to them, rattle the atoms, shear the unit cell, and so on, and you enter into this active learning loop, which is sort of outlined here. So in that loop, you take the machine learned force field that you currently have, you do a simulation with it. A short simulation could be a short piece of MD, could be a geometry optimization. And in fact, while you're doing that, you keep asking, is this model certain about what it's predicting? So there are many ways to do that. One way is that you fit multiple models to see if they agree. And if they don't, then that's a sign that the data is not determining the parameters of the model, so you need new data. And so you go back, you do a DFT calculation on that structure, which gave rise to the model disagreement. You go back, train a new force field, continue the simulation. At the end, when you're done with this short simulation, you might do a DFT calculation to check what happened. So if this was a geometry optimization, you could ask, the geometry that I ended up with, the binding pose of this small molecule that my current model says is a local minimum, is it actually a local minimum in DFT? If it isn't, you know the drill. Go back, retrain the force field, come back. And you do this a number of times. Here I have 6 different versions of 6 different stages of this, and we do molecular dynamics in most of them. Here we do geometry optimization, and finally we do nudged elastic band calculations to actually get at these pathways of the catalytic reaction. And when you do this enough times, you collect about 700 DFT calculations, you end up with a model that does the right thing. And that's sort of illustrated at the bottom here. So the black lines here represent, from the literature, density functional theory calculations of the binding energies of these various fragments along the pathway. And these parabolic curves represent real barriers calculated with nudged elastic band. And the green is the model. So you can see that it sort of matches the black within sort of line width precision. And that is, and then we've achieved the goal. Question is, one question you could ask is, 2 years of graduate student work doing writing software, protocols, fiddling with the details, and finally we managed to do what this paper, Dang et al. Has done with DFT. So what have we actually achieved? So there are 2 answers to that. One is that this protocol is supposed to be generic, so one could go and try it for now a new system where the answer is not known, and converge and get a model, and using an investment of 700 DFT calculations, then be able to compute properties of this system, which you can't really do with DFT. Finite temperature, free energy barriers. Those things take millions of single-point calculations, which are not feasible with DFT, but very easy with the model. Another thing that one can do is take this model and explore this reaction and maybe find pathways that have been overlooked. So these pathways, where I'm showing the agreement with DFT, have been it's kind of handcrafted, using a lot of chemical intuition and a little bit of trial and error. People have found these purportedly lowest energy pathways. But if you have a fast model, you can do a lot more searching. So you can ask, if I try 10,000 different pathways between this state and this state, do I find something with lower barrier? And when we've tried it for the very first time, just as a simple experiment of this idea, immediately we found this purple pathway here, which has a 40% lower barrier than the barrier which was hitherto the largest barrier in this system. So I think even with systems where people think they know what the best transformation pathways are, I think there are new things to be learned. So, lots of us are working in this field, and there's a huge amount of activity. A lot of new methods are being developed, and you should always look at what the new methods are, what they achieve, and then who's using them. Because really, a good method is one that is used by people who have not developed it. So these are all examples of very high profile, very interesting papers doing science, not doing method development, not selling their favorite new idea of how to make a force field. This is, again, on catalysis. This is an iridium oxide surface where new surface complexions have been discovered as a function of chemical potential. This paper is on high pressure hydrogen. I think Ping is an author on this, and it's appeared in Nature. And again, leveraging methods developed by other people to do cutting edge science. On the right side here, I have the example of a device scale modeling where you have this is a phase change memory material. These are electrodes, cross electrodes like this. You put a small piece of this germanium antimony telluride in between each pair of the electrodes. So these are fabricated in the lab. It's about 500,000 atoms in this little block. And the simulations here allow you to, in real time, at the length scale of the experiment, monitor the crystallization and amorphization that is used to store a bit in this material. This is by Volker Dedinger, now in Oxford, former fellow in my group. Okay, so I want to get on to the main topic now of the highlight of the presentation, which is how do we get rid of this pain of iterative training? So everything that's been done sort of up to 2020, people have been making models for specific systems in the materials space. Every material is different. you make a new force field when you want to study a new material. And that meant that really this was in the hands of, you needed expertise. You needed expertise in creating these force fields, setting up those complicated workflows. And that has changed because not us, but other people have realized that it's worth fitting to large, diverse databases, because that allows you to create a model that has some use without any training when you go to a new material. So I didn't pay much attention to this. I wanted to focus on getting the most accuracy out of application-specific models. But students at Berkeley here, and some of them are maybe here, fitted models on the materials project with our architecture, MACE, and with a tiny bit of help from my students, they turned out to be very good. So you can imagine this is the training data, very small inorganic crystals, all known experimentally created inorganic crystals, and another batch of sort of hypothetical crystals, but all very small, periodic, but covering the whole periodic table, almost all, 89 elements. And there's a leaderboard called MathBench Discovery, and this is in November 2023, so sort of a year and a half ago, and MACE model jumped to the head of this. Now, what does this leaderboard measure? It measures the prediction of energies of materials that are known or certainly being calculated quantum mechanically, but withheld from training. So it's like a test set. So how good are you at measuring the energy, or the energy away from the best known in that energy and volume space, so the best known, it's called the convex Hull distance. How stable is that material, essentially? So this was very nice, but we still didn't think that this was a usable force field really for anything else. But it did stimulate a lot of activity. So a few months later, the GNOME model from Google was released and showed a huge improvement on what we did, by training on something much, much larger. So instead of training on the 1.6 million structures, they trained on 90 million structures, which I think the whole training set is still secret. So it's a bit of an unknown. But it's a very, very good model. And then this sort of set off a whole huge amount of activity, both academically and with companies. So the top models here, this is from a later snapshot. This is MatterSim from Microsoft. This is Orb from Orbital Materials, another startup. This is from the materials team at Facebook, Equiformer V2. And you can see that they're just getting better and better at this F1 score, which is an aggregate score of how good you are at measuring material stability. So the measuring and predicting these energies, of course, is important if you want to filter proposed new materials, but it doesn't mean that you have a good force field for other kinds of simulations, so like molecular dynamics, which really needs the force field to be smooth, the model to be smooth and predict force as well. So this new column, kappa, was introduced, which is an aggregate measure of force accuracy. It's actually an experimental observable. It's the thermoconductivity of the material, the phonon contribution of thermoconductivity, which relies on how good the forces are. And you can see that it completely anti-correlates in this top part of the leaderboard with accuracy on energies. So models that have very, very good energies have either very, very poor forces or so poor that they didn't calculate it. Okay, so that's the black. And certainly, sort of at this time, so the MACE model was very good, and this is, again, a few months later where things have changed around a little bit, but still this kappa RMSE gives you a different picture. And I think this is the last one I have. This picture changes, this website changes every week because people submit new models. I think the latest and current best model is the latest model from the Facebook team. And they are very good on the F1 score, and they're also very good on kappa. So it's a very, very active space. But still, is this a good force field for simulating materials? We just have two small observables, energy and thermoconductivity of small inorganic crystals. That's not what the materials world is about. So we did an interesting experiment about a year and a bit ago, which was taking this model that was fit for the small inorganic crystals and tried it for other things, expecting it to kind of blow up or fail when used for something else, as every model, as implicated by the iterative training that was needed always to build accurate models before. And that didn't happen. And that is so surprising that it's sort of hard to convey a year later the shock and amazement that happened when people tried this system to run a battery simulation. Not a small inorganic crystal, but an electrode and electrolyte, and you run it at 500 degrees for a nanosecond, and it didn't explode. And then you run it for predicting the properties of hybrid perovskites, aqueous interfaces of salts, polymerization of sulfur, amorphous carbon, catalysis, burning of hydrogen. All of these simulations ran with the model that's trained on a small inorganic crystals. It's very difficult to reconcile that with earlier, with the way things worked earlier. Mathematically, deeply, we don't really understand why this is. But it's a fact that all these models work, all these systems. Now, one has to be very careful about saying what have we achieved, but I think what has changed is the workflow. So these are qualitative results. When I say these models work, they don't necessarily give accurate, scientifically relevant observables. For some systems they do, but for not all of them. But what you can do that you couldn't do before is take this model, that's why I call it a foundation model, and run long simulations on all these systems and collect a few data points, a few structures, and refine and get ab initio accuracy. And that idea is, of course, not new. But the fact that you don't need iterative training, you don't need a complicated workflow to get a model, but just take the foundation model, run on anything you want. It's chemically sensible and reasonable, and when you refine it, you get first principles accuracy. So this is sort of the highlight of my career so far, writing a paper with 88 authors, some of which I didn't know. It's the first paper where I needed a spreadsheet to keep track of my authors and to see what they did and who I emailed. It was sort of a new experience for me, and a fantastic experience in terms of just the social aspects of science. How do you actually do this? How do you take 22 PIs and assemble their teams and get contributions? And it was essentially, without fault, a positive experience. No conflicts. Everybody delivered. It's also sort of an amazing way to do something. Of course, you don't do this every week. But it is something new. And this was the only way to do this work, because I'm not an expert in any of those downstream applications, but the experts are here. So you needed to collect people who know about those different materials problems. So let me just show you two small examples of how it works. So the first one is MOFs. Of course, again, talking about MOFs has strong connections to Berkeley. But it turns out that this model is quantitatively accurate in MOFs without any fine-tuning. So this is sort of a scatter plot of energies of a completely different database. This is the QMOF database that Andrew Rosen sort of spearheads. And you see almost all the density of the data is that you get very, very good energy accuracy out of the box when you vary the MOFs. There's 20,000 different MOFs. The little scatter of inaccuracy comes from incompatibility between the pseudopotential of the test database and the original training database. And that's sort of verified here for these. These are the errors projected onto the metal atoms in the MOF, and these are exactly the ones with the color are exactly the ones where the pseudopotential is different. If you use consistent pseudopotentials, then this cloud disappears. But here's an actual application. So this is CO2, and this is MOF 74. And if you look at if you do a nanosecond simulation, you can get the free energy, the map. So where does CO2 bind and how strongly? And this is what we get from the model out of the box. This is what a purpose-built neural network model, as you need a neural network model to do a nanosecond simulation of this system. So this DeepMD model was fitted and trained using the painful iterative scheme. to this particular system. And this is what you get if you take an off-the-shelf empirical force field for MOFs, right? So that's too weak a binding. And these binding binding maps match much better. And so now you have a tool that works out of the box, so you can vary the metal atoms. These are 7 different metal ions. These are 14 different linkers. And you can just run this simulation in parallel, a nanosecond long simulation to screen the binding energy, binding free energy of CO2, and you can explore the MOF space. Here's my other example, again, back to catalysis. And really just, rather than going through all the details, just let me show an example of fine-tuning. So it's a copper surface, and these are various reaction steps. And this dark red line is the DFT answer. So that is the minimum energy path along these reaction paths. The orange is the model out of the box. And now you see why it's not yet a complete replacement to DFT. It gets these binding energies of various fragments incorrectly by about half an EV. It's definitely not good enough to do to just be used like that. Although the peaks and troughs are in the right place. So this is the idea. This is what I mean by the model is kind of working qualitatively the right accuracy. It gives you the right kinds of chemistry, but with some energy offsets. So we take 5 snapshots from the orange curve where we explore the reaction, do the FT on them, fine-tune the model, and you get the light blue curve. So that's the fine-tuned model, which now gets you the right barriers, gets you the right binding energies, sometimes makes mistakes that are much smaller. So remember, only 5 configurations were used to fine-tune. And when we do single-point checks, validation checks on the paths with this fine-tuned model, that's the dark blue, and that's essentially overlay. So we get DFT accuracy on those paths, having done just a tiny bit of fine-tuning. Takes 1 hour on a GPU. So that's the end. And really, this is sort of the outro slide that we now have force fields for the full periodic table. It can do thousands of atoms, tens of nanoseconds on a GPU, and ab initio accuracy when fine-tuned, which takes very little effort. The compute is modest. The key, I think, is dataset diversity. The biggest scientific question for me is why does this work? And I think that's got something to do with the correspondence between these graph neural network architectures and real quantum mechanics. And that is what I'm exploring in the next couple of years. And in terms of model improvement, we can't really move on into there's some applications where you can't go on without explicit charges. So Coulomb interactions, which are not part of the model that I've shown you, but they're clearly needed for many applications. So some sort of charge self-consistent potentials is where I want to go. And then the next interesting thing is increasing the level of electronic structure theory. So if you want to bring materials and molecules together, organic chemistry is sort of the weak area of this model. You need better quantum mechanics, actually, to make good progress there, and how to actually reconcile that with the level of electronic structure that's possible to use for materials is sort of a new question, and it's now needed because we want to fit these things together. So thanks very much, and we're happy to answer some questions, or we can defer them, some of them, to the later panel.
Thanks so much for the great talk. Any couple questions for Gabor?
Thank you. So this is very informative, and it shows the real power of machine learned potentials. They're trained on DFT data sets, is that correct?
Not always, but mostly. When we go to very large data sets, it's DFT, but there have been many good works which, in the sort of iterative, system-specific case, where you push and add on a correction to couple cluster, add on other kinds of system-specific models, but these generic models have not been.
But they're quantum calculations in the end.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So the better the quantum calculations, the better the machine learning potential would be in terms of faithfulness to actual observation. So this, I'll make that one comment.
I mean, that has to be true. If that's not true, we failed.
Right. Okay.
right.
And the second is a different question. Chemical reactions happen on a free energy landscape and surface. Now, quantum mechanics gets the potential energy. You can extend that to the enthalpy. With AIMD, you can go now towards the doing the simulation to get the entropy. Is that how you get your entropy contribution to the free energy?
That's right. So these are, the goal here is really to do what AIMD does, but a million times faster.
Fine,
so
sure.
you can now do free energies. That's
Right.
exactly right. That's what I showed in the MOF, but in the catalysis also. Much catalysis science is zero temperature calculation, and that needs to change.
Which is not useful.
That's right. Yeah.
So how accurately do you get the free energy landscape for, say, chemical reactions such as CO2 to methanol?
Yeah. So there, it's a very that's a much higher level of validation that you're asking about. And the question is, how do you know what the right answer is? So, because you can't do it with ab initio, right? So we then have to now switch to actually validating things that we can somehow directly compare to experiment. But experiment doesn't give you the free energy surface.
No, it doesn't.
So that's right. So I think there's a lot more interesting work to be done on how you actually, what you calculate, because you couldn't calculate these things before. I can give you a few examples from sort of ongoing work where we take the machine learned potential and now go and compare with experiments. So I have a project on single atom alloys where people measure, so they experiment very carefully, engineers single atom replacements of a copper surface, and then doing and you do the catalysis and measure what comes off in what order when you vary the substituted metal. And now you say, let's assume that the free energy barrier heights correlate with the order between the different substituents. And that comes out kind of perfectly with the potential. But this is just like any study that compares to real experiments, has some assumptions built in.
Yeah,
that's right.
So you can do microkinetic
That's
calculations
exactly
of
the goal.
all the rate coefficients, put them together, the matrix, and calculate the
yes, but of
rate
course,
of reaction.
bear in mind that your first comment will always be limited by the level of DFT. So I think to get real actual rates, the microkinetic people know this very well. You'll need to kind of fine-tune the rates to match the experiment, right? Because I think the DFT, because this is not high-level quantum chemistry, this is because of these solids, you're kind of stuck with essentially a meta-GGA. So you can expect errors of several KT on the barrier.
All right, I think we're going to move on. There'll be more discussion later with the panel. So thanks for the great questions, Alex. I just want to introduce Teresa Head-Gordon. I'm sure many of you know she's a Chancellor's Professor of Chemistry, Bioengineering, and Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering at UC Berkeley and a faculty scientist at Berkeley Lab. Her research focuses on developing cutting-edge computational models and methodologies to solve complex problems in chemistry, material science, and biophysics. Teresa is widely recognized for her contributions to the field, with honors including the fellowship in the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering in 2016 and the American Chemical Society in 2018. Her group's work is foundational to many high-performance computing tools used across the scientific community.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you for everyone for the opportunity to come talk here today and to talk about foundation models. And thought I would start off with sort of a little bit of a higher level view of the fact that I sort of grew up during the time in the golden age of computing, right? And so here what I'm showing is just our, the sort of Moore's law and the fact that transistor density sort of gave rise to, more and more compute power, and that compute power has essentially allowed us to computational chemists and theorists to do amazing things. And, while this is petered out, we're looking at quantum computing, we're looking at the things of sort of the use of GPUs, because really the need for compute and being able to define foundation models is actually going to continue, to be an important factor for our making progress. The second type of progress that we have to make is that right now what we're living through is the golden age of data. And so depending on how you want to quantify it, you know, how much are we generating, how much are we storing, how are we querying it, et cetera, we can see this exponential rise and this sort of projection that we're at the sort of zettabyte level, and that pretty much we're starting to run out of prefixes. And so Yoda comes next, right? And in fact, recognizing this kind of impending disaster, you know, the powers that be actually decided that we better start adding some new prefixes. And in fact, in 2022, the Rona and the Quota came on board, okay, for that very reason. So the second thing I wanted to then emphasize is that data and data sizes will continue to be important in foundation models. And so my group has also worked on, you know, it's kind of divided up into people who are interested on the physics side. And really what I'm trying to emphasize here is that there's just a huge range of complexity, especially at the molecular level. Gabor did a wonderful job of sort of highlighting the material side of things as we essentially consider all of this complexity of different phases, the ability of enzymes to catalyze reactions at remarkable rates that we're trying to mimic with catalysts like, for example, Dean Toth's group develops, and sort of new phenomena that we're actually seeing at interfaces for chemical reactivity. And then the other half of my lab is we're sort of doing lots and lots of machine learning, which I'm going to describe to you today. But the thing that I think has sort of taken me by interest and surprise is this idea of the fact that it's not just machine learning, and I'll actually sort of define this more carefully in just a few minutes, but the sort of the rise of AI. And you know, Omar, for example, you know, is completely convinced that his whole lab is transformed. This is a collaboration that I was thankfully part of, very indirectly with my student, Ufan Zhang, and also with Christopher and Jennifer and Omar, about these sort of AI-driven labs. All right, so with that then, what I wanted to do is to say that the third piece that has to come into play to deal with that kind of complexity is to think about the underlying architectures. And so natural language processing and this idea of multimodal AI is essentially just invading our daily lives, right? I mean, this is something where, you know, we're seeing, you know, the disruptive nature, okay, of how AI is developing. And all of this is based on sort of, for example, natural language processing and multimodal AI that's allowing us to, you know, to do things that, you know, were impossible, right, even 5 years ago. So they rely on this transformer architecture, right, and things like attention and self-attention, and like I said, which is that they are able to understand context. And with that context, and you then combine this now with GPUs, and what they're great for is the ability to scale up, okay? So the idea then is that now when you put all of these things together, like architecture and data, and this ability of sort of GPUs or TPUs or other types of computing, is that now we're going to, you know, get to a level of where we can do things with AI that actually it's competitive to us in our abilities to be able to do new science. All right, so these large language models are by definition foundation models. And the reason why they are foundation models has been suggested is because they, like I said, they've been scaled up on large transformers, lots and lots of parameters, massive data, and things like GPT and Llama have come out of these. And they're foundation because it is thought that they obey scaling laws. And so that will be my first sort of assertion, that if we're going to talk about foundation models, and we can see that these foundation models actually genuinely work, they work because they unlock at scale, which is that combination of compute power and parameters and data. All right, and so with that, the promise is that we will get to a point where they'll be so versatile at that point that they'll be able to do downstream tasks with no changes or minimal changes without, to their model parameters. And so that is sort of a goal that I think we want to set ourselves for science and technology. So now this large language model, I just wanted to sort of introduce, which I'll actually talk about later, is something we have actually been trying to work with in the science context. And the idea is this is developed by Meta, released in February of 2023. It's publicly available. The thing that I like about this, part of my teaching is to actually teach ethics. And so the idea is that I think that this is ethically sourced data. They try to remove sort of personal data from the scraping. There is also upsampling of data that they consider to be trustworthy. They've got these models that have been trained on different parameter size. This is maybe even out of date now, but half a trillion parameters, making them incredibly powerful. And the thing that I want to just sort of say that they're mainly trained on English data, with about 5% and sort of coming from about 30 other languages. So I'm going to come back to this later in the talk. I won't belabor this point too much, but now you can combine this with vision. And so we start thinking about multimodal AI. And the thing that, again, I want to emphasize is how were these developed? These were developed, again, with the same idea of being able to take their foundation. They have lots of versatility. They define these sort of scaling laws. And then here's how data was collected, which was, again, scraped without any human curation, okay, with, for example, this lion, which at UC Berkeley, where we've actually recommended that you not use it because of the fact that some of that data, being uncurated, has sort of content that you have to put sort of safety holds on, okay? So a little of a side, but it's also a useful foundation model that almost certainly, because chemistry is a visual, 3D molecular, molecules are essentially have a way to be visualized as well. All right, so science data is growing fast. And so what I'm showing here, this is a paper that we have submitted and is under review about sort of understanding these foundation models. This is work that I've been doing with Sam and Bing Ching and Aditi and a bunch of other people and lots of good postdocs and grad students in the audience. So thank you very much. And so this, I'm just showing the molecular data sets, okay, that are being developed. And the criteria here was that these were labeled data of molecules that had energies and force labels and were at least a million in size content. And so what we can see is we come all the way down here. Now here's some unsupervised data sets, and I really like this, and I'm going to talk more about this later. But the idea is that scientific data is growing really fast. Okay, so we've got lots of supervised data sets. It's really rapidly catching up, and therefore gives us this promise, this one component that we got to have, which is that do we have enough data to be able to take advantage of large architectures with lots and lots of parameters effectively. All right, and so, and I think that science is catching up and starting to understand the power of being able to define define good foundation models. All right, so I'm going to distinguish the two types of work that my lab does and what I think how the field is organized in regards to machine learning and artificial intelligence. All right, so we know that artificial intelligence is, the inspiration comes from different aspects of human cognition, visualization, those are kinds in language, et cetera. And we have these different architectures, and now we essentially see the dominance currently of transformers. And that the scientific issues, I see this as two types, which is that there's technical AI, and I think this is very well represented in chemistry and physics. It's really good at automations. It's good at being able to do analysis. That's what we do really as scientists. We're analysts. And for this kind of model building, is, like I said, very well represented. I'll give a few examples of that in my own lab. The philosophical AI is trying to get to a stage where it's reasoning like we do as scientists. And I think that Omar did a really nice job yesterday of trying to say, when he was using his AI tools and finding that there were some MOF structures that he had anticipated, they kind of fit into his view of the periodic table, but there were others that took him by surprise. And that's the ability to then, think like a scientist about new ideas and new directions. And that is essentially a very interesting goal, for how we might exploit and how I think about what could be very profound foundation models. All right, so this is the kind of complexity that we want to do. These are difficult systems, and so, but the thing that I like about physics models is that you can rely on them. If you can do it, these can be very predictive. Now, the technical AI part, though, is the fact that maybe I do want to understand this chemistry or that chemistry, and there was what kind of architectures are we going to build? We feel that in order to understand chemistry and materials, that we would, molecules and materials, that we need to satisfy certain basic properties, these so-called equivariant properties. And so there was kind of an arms race during COVID, 2020, 21, 22, where people were building. And I think the field has sort of recognized that message passing graph neural networks are pretty good, for the type, and also imbued with transformer type of architectures. And so we had developed one, it's called NewtonNet, and it was also a graph neural network that was able to also satisfy these equivariant features that we thought would be very important. And one of their benefits was thought to be the need for less data. Not more data, but less data. But let me tell you why that actually is important. And that is because this is the gold standard. So this data, is not DFT. This is what we think is our best approximation to quantum mechanics, H psi equals Z psi. And what we're seeing is some benchmarks of just, single molecules. And so what we can see is that lots, Newton is doing very well. But the key thing that I want to emphasize is that, that this kind of data is going to be very hard to come by at the scale, at the scale that we need. And so therefore, what we're going to have to do is to, consider other data sets or, consider, new ways, to how we're going to deal with this data scaling problem. But I did want to emphasize that this is the data that we're interested in is at this level of theory. And then what I'm just showing is that the model, these message passing neural networks are data efficient. They reach accuracies, chemical accuracies, well below sort of standard architectures like the ANI with just sort of 5 to 10% of the original data. And then we had developed a hydrogen combustion data set ourselves. Okay. Now, the reason why is that Gabor brought up a really good point, which is that the machine learning models, and this is part of the technical AI problem, is that they're dumb as doornails, that you have to teach them everything. So, for example, what I'm showing here is in this hydrogen combustion data set, is that we forgot to tell it, hey, molecules are more stable than atoms, and therefore it hadn't put in the atomization energies. And so we had, after training, we had to go back and essentially put them in, retrain. And so that's silly, that's my bad. I should have thought about that, but I didn't. And so then we go to the next thing, which is that now there are these unanticipated species. This reaction should not essentially be introducing a hydronium. And it turns out because the model thinks that it's actually low energy, when the ground truth says it's much, much higher in energy, and therefore that has to be put back into the data. And what I really am trying to illustrate here is that data acquisition is actually not intuitive. So in other words, the idea is that how was I supposed to know that the model need to have things explained to it that a physics model wouldn't have to explain. But the thing is, as I've already brought up, active learning is a big cost. Now, I think, I don't know why you're getting 6 orders of magnitude, and I believe you, because all I'm just saying is that this is just our timings without putting any effort into optimization. But the idea here is just simply saying that if we compare, doing the machine learn potential and then compared to the sort of the ground truth DFT, we're getting sort of 2 to 3 orders of magnitude improvement, but we have to keep going back and doing active learning. And so what we decided to do is that after a while, you might as well just go ahead and plug in the original data source, okay, as opposed to sort of retraining again, because you don't have to do that too often so that you get the same speed up, okay? You still get the sort of the same increase in the number of atoms or the time scale, and that ultimately this is a way to get out of that endless active learning so that you can do some chemistry. Okay, so I won't describe this too much other than to say that originally on the original surface before active learning, it was predicting transition states that were completely wrong. By the time you were finished, you essentially learned something about how the actual reactions actually work. All right, so here's another example of technical AI. And here is this so-called the surprise that came out when Google's DeepMind developed AlphaFold 2. And so what I wanted to sort of emphasize is the fact that effectively, you used to tell students, this is a grand challenge problem. No one has been able to solve the protein folding problem. And it's now solved. Like this is no longer a grand challenge. And what you could see, the criticism, if it will, is why I call it technical AI, is that really all the basic biophysical principles still held, in the nature of the architecture. Doing sequence alignments and doing structural templates, and then of course learning on the vast amount of structural data allowed it to essentially just pick up deep correlations. But what I really kind of also wanted to point out is that it really took industrial strength resources, okay? Things that an academic lab, we're now up to H200s that we're trying to buy right now. But the idea here is that they were using TPUs and these are tensor processing unit type things, and like I said, industrial strength resources. So you can't train an AlphaFold 2 model in academia. And so what I really kind of want to emphasize is that that's where the action is happening on being able to do real foundation model work, I think, because of the need for scale, is in industry. And so I think what we need is kind of a human genome-like project of essentially a national government lab type consortium, okay, that can essentially get the same level of resources and to be able to do these kinds of things that are currently only possible in industry, okay? Anyway, so the thing is that also we don't sit on our hands. All science essentially is going to move forward. And the point is that biology is dynamic, and that's something that AlphaFold 2 can't do, all right? And so what we're showing here is that, in fact, the most, ambitious part of structural biology right now are these proteins that have intrinsic disorder. And so these are 50% of the proteome. Yeah, they're huge, and the point is they're extremely dynamic. They do lots of interesting things. They undergo phase separation. They also do things like folding upon binding. And so because of that versatility, they really are the next frontier in structural biology, and therefore AlphaFold 2 really can't touch that. Okay, so that's an opportunity. And what I'm showing here is my great student Ufan, who has essentially been able to transform those transformer-based and combined with diffusion into a model we call IDP Forge, that these are AlphaFold predictions of those regions of disorder. And so, they're very honest about saying that we have no confidence in those regions. We don't know how to model them. So they're just modeled as essentially strings. And what Ufan's been able to do is to then take an AlphaFold 2 type prediction and to be able to manifest, and this is kind of a representative of all the members of an ensemble, of the underlying dynamics. Okay, so that's a sort of another example of technical AI. This is just what the architecture looks. Oops, sorry. That's what the architecture looks like there. And again, we're transformer based, and we're using, the attention models, and essentially trying to accumulate as much data as possible to be able to actually predict these ensemble representations. And so I'm going to sort of quickly, because I want to kind of move through to the other parts of my talk, is to just simply say that IDP4 is now annotating the AlphaFold 2 proteins, and we're calling this AlphaFlex, okay? All right, so now I want to turn to the philosophical AI. And I'm going to motivate it by something that's really important, of course, which is drug discovery. And I was part of a big NIH center, an antiviral drug discovery center, where the government ordered us halting research on March 25th, because, of course, the Trump administration doesn't believe in pandemics anymore and thinks that we won't have another one. But this is what we were doing with lots of experimental colleagues. And so here's maybe a target. That's the main protease of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We'd like to find drug molecules, and so it's been speculated that there's about, some ridiculous number that you would have to search through. But furthermore, it can't be just any old of those molecules, but it has to be something that actually forms a 3D structure that binds and inhibits, let's say, the activity of this main protease that's just driving the disease process. All right, but these models aren't very good either. And furthermore, which is that it's not good enough, even if it's a good binder, they gotta be safe, okay? You gotta be able also to synthesize them, okay? So you can talk about 10 to the 60, but someone's gotta make them. And so the question is, how are you gonna make them is part of the question. Not everything is synthesizable. All right, so I think large language models are here for biochemistry, and I think the way to think about it is not just as a chatbot, okay, which is cool, it's a good idea, something we should definitely exploit, but I think that it actually should be able to speak the language of chemistry as well. And I think the idea that I'm thinking about here is follows, which is that, smile strings are linear strings of characters, right? And therefore, why this might be very useful is that this is just a linguistic construct, right? It's not a computer data structure that's not how I think about it anymore. I think of it as a language. If it's a language, then that means that I should be able to get a large language model, which I know is foundational, okay, to be able to take advantage of learning this new vocabulary. And so the thing is then, I want to show you, can we speak about drug discovery? And can we tell which are going to give me viable synthetic pathways? And then the idea is that could I even get to a point where I could think about a language describing geometry and geometry of things like transition states. So this is Smiley Llama that we introduced. And so the idea here is that we're just taking that foundation model. We're doing prompt engineering and supervised fine-tuning with also a technique called direct preference optimization, very easy. And what we did is we just took 2 million smile strings of drug molecules, and then we fine-tuned Llama's 3.1 8 billion model. So we started this in January of 24, and by July, when they released this model, it was already noticeably better. We could actually see just sort of improvements almost immediately, only 6 months later, emphasizing how fast this field is moving. All right, so then after we train it, then we essentially can provide, drug-like properties that we want in the prompt, which is that we worked with the medicinal chemists. They sort of have very strong opinions about how many rotatable bonds and what kind of hydrogen bonding, donors and acceptors, and making sure that you don't have liabilities, metabolic liabilities, all kinds of things you can specify in the prompt and fine-tune on. All right, so this is just simply showing that this is what drug medicinal chemists care about, is that they want these kind of properties. This is stuff that we can optimize through the prompt, okay, to be able to then generate molecules. And what I'm showing here is then that very small amount of data, okay, that I fine-tuned on the llama model, showing that Smiley llama, which can generate a gazillion molecules now, is able to essentially reproduce those drug-like properties, okay, through that fine-tuning. And so we're carrying this through to SARS-CoV-2 now. And so this is, I won't spend too much time other than to say that Smiley llama is how we're going to continue doing lead optimization for a target that is actually not the main protease, but a novel target in regards to trying to understand the SARS-CoV-2 disease. All right, now, it's great. I can generate molecules till the cows come home, but I also need to synthesize them. So another way of thinking about how to fine-tune the model is that let's speak a different language. Let's speak the language of synthesis. And now what we're going to think about, or the way I think about it, is that we're going to come up with a defined chemical space based on reaction templates and building blocks. Okay? So therefore, it's a new sequence. It's a new statistical organization, okay, of reaction pathways. It has, sequence order, time order, based on building blocks. All right? And therefore, we've been able to then supervise fine-tune llama to be syn llama now. And it's been able to now to take, you want a target molecule, you want to know how to synthesize that. What we were able to do is to work with what are called enamine building blocks and reaction templates to tell you exactly if that's feasible and how to do it. Enamine is actually this company in Ukraine, okay, it has been heroic, okay, it's trying to stay afloat. But the idea here is that this is kind of click chemistry. This is guaranteed, okay, that these building blocks and reaction templates, they will be able to synthesize that molecule. All right, so what I'm showing here then, or we can get analogs. That's the other thing, is maybe you want an analog to it. All right, so what I'm showing here is that syn llama works a lot better than if you just train these models in scratch. And so I'm showing some competitors from MIT and their ability to reconstruct molecules. Let's get a kind of a benchmark. So enamine, as a company, can synthesize things with about 85% success rate across all of their catalog, or I should say a catalog that you've generated. 85% of them are synthesizable. And so what we can see is that this is out of 1,000 molecules that syn llama is able to, on the test set, okay, be able to do that about somewhere between 20 to 60%, okay, so it's not perfect, but the idea is that, but we can do something that's really cool because the syn llama is also generative, okay, and it's proposing new building blocks. And if you go to a catalog, which the organic chemists do, they can find these building blocks, and those are therefore synthesizable, and that's what's expanding the space, okay, to more possible synthetic pathways. All right, so the thing is then, returning to MLIPs, will the quantum data always be small scale? Okay, and that's what I'm worried about. I just worry that it's not going to unlock the way we think it will. All right, so there are all these great applications and of things that we would like to do. All right, and the thing is that some of the things don't work perfectly, and therefore this active learning, as we've already said, it's expensive relabeling. It's stuff that is too hard to do. And so therefore, I do think that there's been a thought process about how you generate data that could use some refinement, okay? So here's, for example, this data set has been built on chemical significance. We all think that reactants and products and transition states are what we should care about. But I would argue, if you think about a potential energy surface, almost everything is irrelevant. Okay, what is most relevant are these isolated regions, right? Where are the minima, and then where are the transition states, but everything else, okay? But that's the kind of data that the models never see, but they have to learn it. And therefore, I really like this cheap force field type data idea. This is Wainani and his colleagues in China have been pushing forward on this unimole data set, and then there's also this zinc data set, which this is a subset of this. And you can see that now, this is adding orders of magnitude, right, of data, but it's unsupervised and it's not labeled. And so the question is, how can we use it? And so therefore, I'm going to argue that the data doesn't have to be great, doesn't have to be perfect. And so Eric in my lab has said, bad teachers are good enough, which means that this is typically what happens. I learned a machine learning potential about all the areas that are relevant, and I don't know anything else. Okay, then what I can see, sorry, I guess I have to get going here, huh? I'm almost finished. And what Eric did was to essentially create cheap force field, pre-trained foundation model, if you will, on just high energy states of single molecules. That's it. That's the pre-trained model. Then we fine-tune with very finite, high energy good DFT data on all of the chemically relevant region. And when we do that, we can get very stable MD trajectories, okay, for something like this, which I've forgotten what this one is. This is, what is it again? What is it? Aspirin. Oh, it's aspirin, right. Okay, that's aspirin. And this is then saying you get the liquid state just by doing that sort of fine-tuned training with finite amount of data. And then finally returning to the hydrogen combustion case, this is what a Newton net model trained from scratch looks like compared to that full active learning space. And then this is what we get if we just fine-tune a foundation model, okay, based on those high energy states, okay, that is fine-tuned with the DFT data, which you can see gives pretty good reproduction, okay, of the reactive chemistry. So I will end here. I know I've taken it, but machine and deep learning, it's all of those technical AI, are foundational to what we do on our daily, bread and butter type of stuff. But these large language models, like I said, seem to be outperforming chemical language models if you can cast your problem in terms of a syntax or a vocabulary. But finally, but can we get foundation models to do things that are more quantitative, okay? Being able to predict energies and forces and geometries. And therefore, it really still is an open question about how these are going to be constructed at scale and their impact. And so these are some of the questions that maybe we'll start talking about during the panel discussion. And thank you very much for your patience while I finish this off. Thank you. Oh. And let me thank also my colleagues and funding sources. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thanks, Teresa. One or two quick questions, and we'll move on to the panel discussion, if anyone has anything related to the talk.
Hi, thank you for that very dense and eye-opening talk. So you're aware there's some politics about the models and how you describe them. So the description foundation model is not exactly nailed down, Although what you say, it's sort of a nit, I'm just amazed at what I'm looking at, really. And there's more to talk about it that way.
Okay, thanks. Yep, I agree.
That's actually a nice lead-in to a panel discussion question. So maybe we can just head right there. I know. Shall we come sit down?
Oh, I see. Yep.
So both of our excellent speakers kind of provided their own perspective on this, but I'm curious to hear more of a discussion on kind of connecting to that last question. How should we seek to determine if a model is foundational?
Well, so we get to answer. Okay. I thought the audience gets to answer. Okay. All right. Is this on?
If think so.
So I think that, again, I agree that my understanding is that foundation models aren't really well defined yet either, but they do satisfy scaling laws. And the reason why I like that Unimol example is that they were literally showing that as they increased parameters in compute and data, that they were getting clear improvements in performance that showed that it was behaving the way you think a foundation model should behave, which is to be able to simply just get better, okay? And so I don't think that in chemistry and physics, I don't think that that's been established. I don't think anyone has tried to sort of show that you get, better. Well, except for maybe Aditi making that attempt. But that would be an example of what I'm saying is that I don't think that the field has sort of demonstrated that models are foundation, at least from that definition. And then I'll say one last thing, which is that it's the idea that you would actually be able to predict stuff that you had not anticipated that the model knew about. And so that's why the technical AI is a good example of where it's not learning anything profound. In fact, you have to teach it. But what a foundation model should be able to do is to be able to unlock new science that on data that it wasn't trained on, or that it would be an obvious connection. So that's the second idea.
I can tell you exactly why we named our paper and our model foundational, being vaguely aware of the definitions not being universally accepted. But actually it was to counter the suggestion, this is one of the questions on which we had the most discussion amongst the 88 authors, is that I didn't want to name the model a universal force field, because that gives you the idea that you take it and it's done and you do your science. And that isn't true. And although in some applications it is, and others it isn't, and we wanted to not oversell that aspect. And I liked, just from the word foundational, the fact that it is something on which you build on. And this idea that within that narrower field, in the grand scheme, that the grander scheme of chemistry that was apparent in Theresa's talk, if you now specialize to making potential energy surfaces, then within that, we used to do active learning, and now starting from nothing, and now we have a foundation to build on with much, much, much less data. So I think the English word qualifies. Later on, when I'm not emotionally attached to it, until we make a model that is actually a replacement for, let's say, DFT, I don't want to really call it a true universal model. By the way, that is not entirely out of the question. It's unclear. It's possible that one could make a model that is, for all intents and for MD purposes, replaces DFT, but we're very far from that.
Can you imagine like a way to have a leaderboard for foundationality or degree to which model is foundational? Like what would that look like? Do you think that would be useful to the community?
I think so leaderboards are very controversial with the students, and I'm very much of a split mind to it, because there's no doubt that the MedBench Discovery leaderboard has led, and this sort of a race that Teresa alluded to over the pandemic has led to lots of improvement and excitement. But it's also the bane of our existence, because rather than focusing on models that do useful science, people burn the midnight oil to gain a few percent on some leaderboard. And I think there has to be some kind of compromise. I think leaderboards are too useful. They're not going away. And something that, I'll twist your question a little bit. Instead of the public leaderboard, which everybody wants to just do better at, what are the right tests? So let's take it one further back. Before you talk about leaderboard, how do we assess whether a model is actually universally foundational? And one of the things that we're trying to do is turn the 105-page supplementary of that paper, which each one detailing an application, into a Python runnable test. So that you can say, here's a new architecture, here's a better model, here's a new training, How do I measure that? How do I assess that? I can't spend another 3 months corralling 88 people to do all those tests, and they will change how they do it, and it's not reproducible. But turning that into a formalized set of runnable tests, I think, for us is the next step. Now that can downstream, and we want to make it public. We want people to be able to contribute to it, and perhaps aggregate scores so that you go towards the possibility of having a leaderboard. Although, as I say, that has some downsides too.
I think an example, I mean, I still think that this sort of scaling law idea is kind of an easy one if you can organize the data that way. But anyways, the other thing I was thinking is that, what about, like for example, if you've largely learned on geometric stressors, which is why you're predicting forces, and well, can you predict Hessians? And then maybe the next question is that can you even predict something that's a different environmental stressor, like magnetic properties? In other words, there's no expectation that any of these models would work well. And so that would be an example, I think, of having an unexpected outcome where it's not trained on that kind of chemistry, and therefore, why would it know about it? But it's unlocked something that would be informative about a property that is not in the data set. And so I guess that would be an example of where if the leaderboard could do that, to sort of define properties that would not be expected to be known by most models, that would be useful. Yeah.
Let me just piggyback on that with another question that I had, which Teresa's already partially answered, but just to set the stage more broadly. Large language model foundation models supposedly exhibit emergent capabilities as they're trained on more and more data, although I know that's still somewhat controversial in itself, but some people argue that. What emergent capabilities could you imagine a chemical foundation model exhibiting, and how would you look for such emergence? So you just talked about magnetic properties. I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on the possibility of emergent properties and how you'd look for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Teresa said just now is that there will be kinds of chemistries that are not in the training set, and what happens. And I think even the currently labeled foundation models to some extent do that, because all the training data is periodic and small. And when you go to look at what surfaces and nanoparticles, what these models do for surfaces and nanoparticles, where we know that the electronic structure is completely different, you get sort of sensible things. And this will be, I expect that these things are discriminators between. We know that the earlier non-GNN type architectures didn't really do that. And so I think collecting a few of these, which needs the chemist's knowledge of where is it that when I go, where is it, which part of chemical space do I go to, and have a radically different chemistry there. The potential energy surface, the interaction of the atoms, is just different because the electrons, which are not in my model, behave differently under those conditions. I think we're seeing that to some extent. I want to return to the scaling a little bit, because Teresa mentioned the scaling laws, but there are two directions in which these models are scaled. One is the data, and the other is the model size. And in the large language model space, I think both of those are really important. And the one that you mentioned, Teresa, specifically, and I think the one that has surprised people more in that field is the scaling laws on the model size, right? Where you don't scale the data, but scale the model. In the force field foundational models, what's really been interesting is that it's completely the other way around. So, and this I didn't mention, but it would take a longer technical talk to go into the details, but the model that I showed in the talk today, and that shows these emergent properties, exactly the same size as the model we need to fit a single system accurately. If I want to make a base model for amorphous carbon that gets the density and mechanical properties of small quench structures correctly, a very narrow task, and I train from scratch, I need a model of a certain size, in the Mace case, 1 million parameters, and that same model captures 89 elements and does the kind of extrapolation that I showed. And that is extremely surprising, and we don't really understand why it is. I think it's telling us something about chemistry. It's telling us how elements and geometry are very closely correlated. It's, again, I think it's telling us that this architecture is capturing some physics that's going on, some quantum mechanics. We don't really have that correspondence worked out well. So I'm not yet sure, so this is now a hypothesis, that this kind of generalization comes from the same place where the LLMs get their generalization from, because these scaling laws work the opposite way.
I think another area where I'd like to sort of see what's possible is to have unlabeled data, and because that's easy to generate. There's lots that you can get to scale pretty quickly if you didn't have to do the expense of labeling it with energies and forces. And so I think the force fields really are cheap in the sense of maybe that labeling is the way to go. But what would happen if we just did, and as I understood the unimol work, that was unsupervised, data, geometries effectively, that were then fine-tuned on what are called QM9 properties. And so I guess what I'm just trying to say is that it seems that it's possible that unsupervised learning might be something that should be tried to develop these foundation models.
I'm curious, do you think that these foundation models will just act as kind of surrogate models for faster simulations, or will they be able to discover, do you think that it's likely they'll be able to discover fundamentally new chemical physics that may not be well captured by the theories underlying the data that they're trained on?
At the moment, I'm not thinking about them as other than surrogate models, but I think that's sort of a matter of personal taste. I don't think that's a limitation of these technologies. And I think particularly when you inject them, when you use them as part of multimodal training, which is sort of what Teresa's middle of Teresa's talk talked about, that's where you would see that. I think in my own personal work, I'm interested in exploring the quantum mechanical origins of this generalization, and that is, but I think that's surrogate modeling. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an aspect in the other direction.
It's possible, but I'm not saying that it's likely. I just wanted to make the observation that we all complain about DFT. We know there's a perfect functional out there someplace. And then the question is whether it can be figured out and learned, which I guess would be some type of new chemical physics, right? What is that functional? When I talk to Martin, who knows much more than I do about functionals, he doesn't think that that functional would actually be any good in the end. I don't, so anyways, but just trying to point out that would be, and so I think there is interest in machine learning of functionals right now. I think that's quite active, and so whether that will actually yield this sort of, this universal functional that we've all been looking for, that's a possibility. Yeah.
I'd like to riff on that because I think that is, as you were talking, I think that is certainly a place where you can push the idea of surrogates into regions which they've never done before, right? So when you think of a surrogate, you think, okay, it's purely a matter of I'm able to run the model, but it's slower, so I have a faster replacement. But what if can I ever have a model that is effectively giving me, let's say, coupled cluster accuracy on a periodic metallic system? You can't run that. There is no code. The electronic structure theory isn't there. But is it possible that we take these models and train them using multi-fidelity data, and because it has seen coupled cluster for molecules, and it has seen a lot of solid data, by being regular, being smooth, being an interpolant, it now actually tells you what kind of beyond DFT potential energy surface for a metal is consistent with the coupled cluster data for molecules that is being provided. So I think that maybe is a possibility where you could do new chemistry just because you're merging different parts of existing chemistry in the form of a consistent potential energy surface.
All right, last question. I know we're a little bit over time, but Teresa mentioned, when you're thinking about scaling, especially in the context of these LLMs, the academia has kind of been left behind by companies. And as we think about generating more and more data and training on more and more data, I'm curious to hear both of your perspective on how, on the road ahead for kind of academics and companies to work together, and how, Teresa mentioned the vision of kind of a human genome project scale effort driven, by government funding. That'd be amazing, TBD. But yeah, how do we exist as academics and still contribute in this ecosystem where compute is king and the companies have stuff that on the scales that we don't?
So, as I said, that part of my teaching is to teach ethics. And one of the things that I'm a little bit worried about is this strong embedding of AI in industry, where we're a capitalist society, right? And therefore profits are going to drive things forward. So I do think we need a counterweight that thinks about the public good in regards to being able to compete on the same technical level and the science level, just to provide a counterweight. Otherwise, it just is going to be behind IP. I think some of us in this room know that some of the data is not publicly available that's been generated. And that's a problem. And we can't, therefore, check on whether performance of something is actually working very well or not. There's no if there's not transparency. So anyway, so I think that you hope for the best, but you should plan for the worst in regards to how this is going to go in the future. And I really do think that we should think about maybe even a worldwide consortium of academic research labs, governments that will band together, to give us the scale to compete against the big tech giants. Otherwise, we're going to lose control on it. So that's what I'm worried about.
I think this idea is the idea is extremely interesting, and I've been thinking about along similar lines for slightly different reasons. It's not competition, and I think it's going to be hard to get the money together, government, state, public money, to say if the goal is to compete with the companies. It's been very frustrating for me to see and work with the companies recently. Because their goals are very different, often unknown. It's very hard to predict what they're going to do with the resources they have. So it's actually not. So it's not that I want competition. I think we should band together worldwide to form consortia to do things right, and with predictability. And when you set out on one of these consortia, you set yourself the goal of creating data or models. From the beginning, you know how you're going to handle it, how you're going to manage it, how the governance is going to be, and you're not beholden to the whims of companies which have different goals. And I think as scientists, we know how to do this as a community. Other fields in science have done this for decades, extremely successfully. I'm thinking of the astrophysicists who can only build one space telescope every 2 decades. The high-energy physicists who can only build one largest accelerator. Science and public science and universities and labs, government labs, know how to do this. I think as data science and machine learning chemists, we need to just follow that road. It's an arduous thing. It takes a long time, but that is the guarantee of success.
Is the time scale, I think about in machine learning, like 18 months is like a decade. Things are moving so quickly that I worry that government moves too slowly, that, you know, the time it would take you to get a consortium together, I mean, maybe you kind of are constantly reevaluating, but for the astrophysicists or the high energy physicists, there wasn't something else happening that they needed to keep up with. They were the leading edge. They are the leading edge because they're kind of the only game in town. Do you worry about that?
Yeah, so I think data generation is where one should start, because this activity that you're at, the pace of activity you're mentioning is in model building. But actually that's not the big word. Data is the big need, and you know, couple cluster scales as n to the 7. So if you can plan because that's not right. So if you say we want this kind of data, you can plan 5 years ahead how to generate that, what resources you need, because that's not going away. And then the model building can exist. Similarly to the other fields where they run the experiments, generate the data, and then they compete in analysis and modeling, and what do you get out of that data. I think that's the right model. And I'm not, how to make, you know, these models, the data sets have been mentioned. Have we mentioned the OMAT data set? 100 million molecules, solids computed by the meta team. It's so large, you're not going to see another one like that, you know, a year after. You didn't see another one a year after it was published. So those are on a worldwide scale. And so the next one like that will be a year from now or 2 years from now. What should it be? And why should 3 people decide that? What the humanity spends its compute on when it comes to materials data.
Teresa, any last thoughts?
Oh, well, I like the analogy to the other fields of science. I just seen it, like you said, you've seen it done before. I know government moves slow, but what are we going to do? And so it's like I want to think about what we can do, and I think that is something we can do if we could, you know, to kind of push the idea forward. Because if you look at that leaderboard, you know, how many academic labs were there in the very, very top, right, in both data generation and performance? So I don't know. I think we have a role to play. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers and to the audience. Really appreciate it.
Now, feel free to go get some refreshments, and we'll be back in to start at 10:30 with our next session, which is AI data and wildfire management. So.
This was a great session, guys.